Chapter 9 Crisis and Catharsis. Delwyn quickly covered the mirror with the curtain, wondering if Mark had seen her travelling through it. She ran quickly out of the granny flat, her thoughts thick with everything Varun had told her, battling with the anger rising in her throat. What was Mark doing there that late, and why was he spying on her? She raced around the building to confront him. As she bolted around the corner, she wasn't aware that Mark had changed direction and was now following her. He caught up quickly and grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around. "I saw you looking at yourself. You think you're so beautiful. Off with the bloody fairies again." Delwyn was stunned, but relieved at the same time. He thought that she'd been admiring herself. She dragged his hand off her shoulder and made sure that she dug her nails in. He didn't flinch. "What business is it of yours, you freak? What are you doing, spying on me?" Without waiting for a response, she turned to storm off, but he grabbed her by the arm. She screeched, "Get your slimy hands off me! You don't need to be going off into Fantasyland all the time when your aunt is trying to get you sorted," he sneered at her. Delwyn was taken aback with his choice of words, but then she realised that he'd assumed that she was playing rather than being the adult, helping Gwen and getting herself together. "None of this is any of your goddamn business!" she yelled in his face and slapped him hard. He slapped her back. "Grow up, Delwyn. Everyone has to at some stage. You're 30 years old. Get a grip, psycho." The pushing started, back and forth, and the yelling continued until Gwen came storming around the corner. "What the bloody hell is going on here?" she yelled, not believing what she was seeing. "Your niece was playing like she did when she was a kid, in that granny flat, talking to herself in the mirror." Delwyn gasped before shrieking at Mark, horrified that the cat might be out of the bag. "I was not, you liar!" "Oh, so I didn't see you through the window? I didn't see you talking to yourself in the mirror? Is that it?" Gwen interjected. "Stop it, you two." She turned to Delwyn. "Were you in the granny flat after I told you not to go in there?" Delwyn fumed. "What's so bloody special about it anyway? Why can't I go in there?" Gwen said calmly, "Your Uncle Sean said his mum didn't want anyone going in there after she died. No one was supposed to go in there." Mark chimed in. "Yeah, well, Delwyn thinks she's above the law. She can do whatever she likes because she's a fruitcake." "Mark!" Gwen was losing her patience with him too. "That's enough, thank you, I've got this." He started walking back to his truck, saying, "Well, good luck with that nut job is all I can say." "Piss off, loser!" Delwyn screamed after him. Gwen snapped, "Delwyn! Get inside, come on, that's enough for one day." Delwyn thundered off to her room, thinking that it was over, but Gwen was close behind. "All right, I think I've had all I can handle. I'm laying down the law." She was shaking all over as she watched Delwyn throw herself onto her bed. The older woman went over to the chair and sat down, not needing to think about what she wanted to say. She'd already rehearsed it. "This is the last straw, Delwyn. I want you properly assessed. You will follow whatever treatment the doctors say you need, and if you need to be hospitalised, so be it." Delwyn sat up and started crying and protesting, her mental faculties betraying her like another person pushed her soul out of her body. She was barely paying attention to what was coming out of her mouth. "You don't understand. I'm important. I'm a portal stormer." "What?" Chills were shooting up Gwen's spine. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I'm on the path to integration. I've seen my mountain. I'm the only human portal stormer. The Oversouls need me." She was manic now, pacing back and forth in front of her bed, forgetting where she was and who she was talking to. Gwen slowly grabbed her mobile phone from her pocket and dialed Dr. Perdue. As Delwyn raved, Dr. Perdue answered the phone. "Hello? Gwen? Hello? What's going on?" Gwen slowly brought the phone to her lips and hissed, "Listen!" She put the phone on the dressing table as Delwyn continued pacing, waving her arms around for emphasis and ranting. "I'm the only one who can go through the mirror. I subdued my mother, so I'm free. I saw the realms and I know where I fit in now. It's just a matter of time. Varun said I only have one last trial and then I can return to fulfill my destiny as a portal stormer. It all makes sense. Leaving my body and having the hallucinations and accessing one soul in physical form. I can access all portals. That's why I'm a portal stormer." She continued raving as Dr. Perdue called the crisis assessment team on his landline. He also called Dr. Boyd and told her what was happening and to meet him at the psych unit the next day. He told Gwen what was going on and to be agreeable and not to fight with Delwyn but to keep her distracted until the team showed up. So Gwen started nodding and through silent tears she egged Delwyn on, asking questions and allowing the nightmare to continue for 20 more agonising minutes. Then the cat vehicle slowly made its way along the driveway and pulled up to the cottage. 2 medics got out and approached the front door of the cottage. One was male and the other was female. The woman knocked gently on the door and almost straight away Glenn flung the door open and let them in. The woman went with Gwen into Delwyn's room. She was lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling, jabbering to herself about all the things she was going to have to do. When she saw the medic, she sat bolt upright, crazed hazel eyes wide with panic, and said, "What's this?" Gwen tried not to cry as she felt like a traitor. "This is Carla, someone who can help, love." Delwyn jumped up with her hands out defensively. "But I'm not crazy. I've got it all sorted out. It's all making sense." Carla asked calmly, "Hey, Delwyn, have you been taking your pills? Do they help or do they make you sick?" Delwyn didn't see the ploy and owned up to it, thinking it might work in her favour. No, actually." With that, she flipped her mattress and some of the pills went rolling onto the floor. Gwen gasped and Carla smiled and said, "Fair enough. Are they your diaries?" They were all there. "Yep, journals actually. They're all for different things, but these are my secret ones." She picked up the purple and the silver ones, hugging them tightly with white knuckles. "You can't have these because these are my secret plans. I've been working on them my whole life. No one knows. I'm a portal stormer." She was sweating profusely, and even though she could see where it was going, something deep inside her told her that it was how it was supposed to be. Varun had told her that there was more mortal business to attend to, one more trial. "Wow," said Carla. "That's awesome. Say, would you like to come with us and maybe tell us some more about that?" She started calming down and looked at Gwen, who was red in the face and trying her best not to dissolve into further tears. "Sure, I'd be happy to, as long as I can take my journals with me." "Of course you can." Carla motioned over her shoulder to her colleague. "Hey, Delwyn, this is Matt, and he's going to give you something to make your trip a little easier. Is that okay with you?" "Yes, no problem," said Delwyn warmly, calming down and still looking at her aunt, wanting to let her know that everything was going to be fine. The 2 medics slowly went over to Delwyn and sat down with her, giving her a shot and talking in soothing voices. Delwyn started calming down even further and turned to Gwen with tears in her eyes, saying, "You still love me, right?" Gwen lost it and blurted, "Oh, baby, of course I do. Always. Now, you get better and you come back to me, okay?" "Okay," she nodded sleepily, and while Carla and Matt brought her out of the cottage and settled her into the van, Gwen packed a bag for her, blowing her nose and bawling continuously, feeling like a villain. Carla came back to get the bag and to get her to sign the paperwork. "They'll take care of her. Don't worry, she'll be fine. This is for the best." Gwen nodded and tried to get it together, allowing Carla to give her a hug. She followed her out and watched the van pull out of the driveway. Peter came over to her, purring and doing figure eights around her ankles. She bent down and picked him up, cuddling him to her chin. She stood for a long time, wondering what would happen now. After Delwyn arrived at the psych unit, Dr. Perdue met with the medics and debriefed before going on to talk with the other doctor. They had her heavily medicated, so he agreed to come back the next day and meet again with Dr. Boyd. He advised that they needed to do a battery of tests before they came to a conclusion, as the narcolepsy, astral journeys and her history were only the tip of the iceberg. As he turned to leave, he saw the 2 journals on her nightstand, the silver one and the purple one. He asked the doctor, "Are they the ones?" The doctor nodded and said, "I believe so." Dr. Perdue felt a rush of excitement and asked, "You don't think that I could take them, do you? I assure you that I will bring them back tomorrow." Before the doctor could answer, a hissing noise flared up. The night nurse looked over and said, "Don't worry, it's the bloody air vent." The doctor finally answered Dr. Perdue's request. "No, I don't think that would be a good idea. It would destroy any trust we'd like to build with the patient. Wouldn't you agree?" Dr. Perdue shrugged and replied, "Of course. Oh well, good night then." "Good night," the doctor said, closing the door behind him. That night, Gwen called Greg as she felt that talking to Mark wouldn't have been helpful. He came over straight away and was initially angry that Mark had instigated the whole thing. What was he doing, spying on her anyway, bloody pervert? He was gripping his coffee cup tightly and clenching his jaw. Gwen sighed, but couldn't help smiling at Greg's chivalry. "I don't think he was being a pervert, Greg. He stayed behind to finish stacking the logs. You know what a perfectionist he is. Then he just happened to see Delwyn in the flat." Greg frowned into his coffee. He was obviously confused. But how did it escalate from them having a fight to her going crazy like that? If he'd just left her alone, maybe everything would still be all right. Gwen shook her head. "Greg, don't make excuses for her, love. She was going downhill fast. She was hiding her pills. She was pretending to take them. I knew something wasn't right." She bit her lip and rested her forehead in her hand, feeling helpless and sick of the whole situation. Greg leaned back in his chair and shook his head, his sandy hair falling across his face. "Why was she so fascinated with that mirror?" Gwen smiled. "She's always been fascinated with mirrors. Remember when she was little? She would forever be talking to herself in them. We had to throw blankets and towels over them everywhere she went for a long time. I used to have to read her Alice Through the Looking Glass all the time, over and over." Greg laughed with the memories of them at story time. "And Enid Blyton, remember the magic faraway tree?" Gwen also laughed. "Yes, the enchanted wood and the other ones." Greg sipped his coffee and nodded. "I feel bad for her, Gwen. I wish I could be there for her. Mark needs a kick up the arse." "Maybe, but you can be there for her once the doctors know what's going on and she's stabilised, and one day she'll be okay to be released." She was hopeful now. "She can come and live with me and Dad, if it's too much for you. We wouldn't mind one bit. Dad loves her." He was trying to fight back tears, and Gwen noticed. "Oh, love," she said, smiling at his handsome face. "Who loves her?" He laughed and wiped away a tear. "Dad." They laughed, and she put her hand on his shoulder, feeling happy that Delwyn had someone else who could pick up the pieces should anything happen to her. The next morning, Dr. Boyd arrived at Sale, and after settling into a bed and breakfast, she took a taxi to the psych unit. At 45 years old, she was tall and thin and had a matter-of-fact disposition and was usually considered a hard woman, but not as hard as Delwyn remembered. She had always worried about Delwyn since she saw such potential in her. She'd only wanted to push past her childish ways and join the real world. After hearing from Dr. Perdue, she was shocked and horrified to hear that Delwyn had slipped so far, and that now she was hospitalised for the most serious break yet. When she walked into the unit, she was met by Dr. Perdue, who was anxious to get started. She knew so much about him and had been looking forward to meeting him, having been told that he was self-assured, terribly intelligent and sophisticated. The man before her now was acting like an excited schoolboy, nervous and tiresome with his silly questions. She half wondered how he could have been any good for Delwyn. As they sat down on the patio of the doctor's lounge for breakfast and coffee, she asked if she could smoke.
"Oh, I don't know, but go ahead and let's see what happens," Dr. Perdue said, smiling mischievously.
"Oh boy," she responded while rolling her eyes, but she lit up and took a deep drag. "So, who is this doctor they have watching her?" Dr. Perdue was frantically buttering his toast and replied, rather annoyed,
"I think it's something Slavic, I forget."
Dr. Boyd couldn't help herself. "Are you really the famous Elaine Perdue?" she asked mockingly. He stopped buttering and looked at her quizzically.
"Of course, why do you ask?"
"Well, you're acting like an ass." She blew smoke in his general direction and he pulled his head out of the way.
"Excuse me," he said haughtily,
as the doors opened up and a doctor came through, smiling at them both. He was tall and distinguished-looking, with short, wavy, salt-and-pepper hair. He had a high forehead, a long nose, and full lips. He also had strong shoulders and was barrel-chested, with long legs that strode towards them. He held out his hand in greeting.
"Hello! So sorry I'm late. I'm Dr. Vronsky."
Delwyn's therapy was long and convoluted, drawn out by the differences of opinion between the three doctors, experimentation with medication, and her own seesawing emotional state. She stayed in the psych ward for 3 months and went under hypnosis several times, failing to achieve the initial thrill that the first session had produced. Dr. Perdue grew more and more discontented with her, and Dr. Boyd with him, as it had become obvious that the former only wanted to feather his cap with Delwyn's outlandish case and, hopefully, his discovery of a new condition or even a cure. Delwyn responded most favourably to Dr. Vronsky, as he was the most sympathetic to her plight. He was the only one she trusted with her journals, and as promised, he only shared what she'd agreed to with the other 2 doctors. They all knew about the mirror, and one of the few things that they all agreed on was that it had to go. After discussing it with Gwen, they decided that Delwyn's unhealthy attachment to it was holding her back. As long as she knew it still existed, she would believe that she could return to one soul and fulfill her destiny to become a portal stormer. At one of her sessions with Dr. Boyd and Dr. Vronsky, they discussed why she thought the mirror was so important.
"It seems to me, Delwyn, that mirrors in general have always been some kind of a portal to you, right?" asked Dr. Boyd.
"Yes," said Delwyn, bored out of his skull. "Then wouldn't it seem obvious that the deep need for escape was a part of finding an appropriate portal?" Dr. Boyd was trying to keep Delwyn engaged. "Yes," said Delwyn, flatlining. Dr. Vronsky joined in, running his chubby fingers through his hair.
"Delwyn, if you're supposed to be such a gifted portal stormer, wouldn't it be possible that any mirror or any portal would do? Why would you need only one portal? Do you see what I'm saying?"
Dr. Boyd kicked him under the table.
"Ouch!"
He frowned at her and then looked at what she'd written on her notepad. "Stop feeding her delusions." He snorted at her.
"I'm not. Bear with me."
He looked back at Delwyn, who watched him hopelessly, feeling too dopey with the medication. "Delwyn, you understand that if this were all true, you could break through anywhere at any time, right? And yet here you are, stuck in a hospital on medication that you don't like, listening to us trying to change your mind." He smiled, but Delwyn stared blankly at him. She knew he was trying to appeal to her better judgment, but she didn't possess it. Dr. Boyd joined in.
"Delwyn, what if it's wrong? What if it turns out that it was only a hallucination? What if you end up in a place like this for the rest of your life, on meds?
Then Delwyn stood up and waved her hands in the air, feeling woozy but needing to shut them up. Whatever you say, I don't care. Whatever you do, I don't care. I know what's right. I just need to bide my time. You can drug me, you can jail me, I don't care. As long as I get out of here, and as soon as I get out of here, I'm going back into the mirror and I'm never coming out. The doctors looked at each other and sighed. They knew that there was only one solution. When they went to Magpie Meadows to speak with Gwen the next day, she was out with Greg and Mark, who were helping with one of the dams giving birth. Dr. Boyd vomited on the spot and apologised profusely while Gwen took her back to the cottage to clean up. All four of them went back into the kitchen and Dr. Vronsky revealed their plan. Whilst you have the mirror, you see, she will think that she has an escape. If it's gone, then poof! No escape. She will have to face reality. I'd be happy to buy it from you if you like. He smiled at Gwen and she was about to agree until Mark piped up. No, that won't do. If she ever found out, she'd go looking for it and you'd have the same trouble all over again. It needs to be destroyed. Greg rolled his eyes at his brother and said, Right on, Mark. Gore says smash. Mark took a swig of his coffee and then shrugged, saying, It's the only way to be sure. Greg was shocked when Gwen agreed with him. He's right. If she knows that it's been destroyed, maybe even if you videotape it, she'll accept it. Greg started losing it. I can't believe what I'm hearing. First of all, it's like you all believe it's actually a portal. Second of all, Delwyn's going to flip, and who knows how far and for how long. If she sees video of that thing being destroyed, why would you want to torture her like that? He slumped down in his chair, defeated. Dr. Boyd was obviously trying to speak as sweetly as she could. Well, sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind, Greg. We're all worried about her, and I think this will be the catalyst she needs to get her back on track. Dr. Vronsky nodded and then asked, Can we see the mirror? Gwen pulled herself up out of her chair. Sure, why not? Sean wouldn't mind, after she's been in and out of it for God knows how long. She raised her eyes up to the ceiling and winked, and then turned around and led them all to the flat. As they walked down the path, Peter ran across their feet with a vicious growl, as though telling them to get off his turf. Oh, cats are so nasty, said Dr. Boyd, hoisting up her pant legs. Mark and Greg rolled their eyes at each other. Then Mark muttered, City girl. When they got to the door, Gwen found that she had a lot of difficulty with the handle. Eventually, Greg had to push the door open for her, using his shoulder with quite a bit of force. As they walked in, they crunched the shells and sea creatures under their feet. Again, Dr. Boyd screwed up her nose and grumbled disapprovingly. They followed Gwen down the hallway to the mirror, and when she kicked the boxes and baskets out of the way, the curtain fell down by itself, making them all jump. Dr. Boyd squealed, prompting Dr. Vronsky to exclaim, June, really? Making them all laugh nervously. They stood and stared at the beautifully ornate mirror for a moment. Then Gwen told them how it had been acquired mysteriously by Sean's mother, who never advised where she'd got it from. She started tearing up as she looked at it and thought of Delwyn as a little girl, now in a psych unit because of this very mirror. As she turned to walk off, she said over her shoulder to Mark, I don't care, but do it now before I change my mind. She continued walking out to the front door, wiping away tears and kicking debris out of the way. The doctors followed, but Greg stood there, still staring at it as Mark raced off to get a wood splitter. He remembered Delwyn staring at herself as a child in whatever mirror she was in front of. He remembered her saying, Hello, who are you? I'm Delwyn. Who are you? That's a nice house you have there. And giggling.
He felt the tears forming and decided to leave, but as he turned, he thought he saw something moving in the mirror's surface, a ripple running across it as though in a lake. He stopped and looked back, but it was still, and he saw his frowning reflection looking back at him. Without warning, Mark bustled through, and with a powerful swing, he brought the wood splitter down hard in the middle of the mirror. The sound was almost deafening as it smashed, and thousands of pieces fell to the floor. Mark had a crazed look on his face as he continued destroying it, swinging the splitter like a maniac. Greg walked out in disgust, yelling out to his brother, "Knock yourself out!" After the mirror was completely destroyed, Greg and Mark cleaned up and hauled the remains off to the burning heap at the back of Gwen's property, where they burnt it along with other assorted debris to finally be rid of it. When the doctors got back to the ward, Dr. Vorunsky went to see Delwyn and carefully told her the news. She collapsed into a fit of woeful sobs and cried for 2 days straight. They decided not to sedate her so she could get it out of her system, but it took another 3 months with more therapy and medication before she was deemed fit to be released. During that time, Gwen and Greg came to visit, bringing fruit baskets, books and stationery. At first she was hostile towards them, then she simply ignored them. After a while she was cordial and almost her old self, but she wasn't the same happy-go-lucky Delwyn. Sometimes on their way back home, Greg would cry quietly and complain that Delwyn's soul had been stolen. Even though Gwen agreed, she would try to pretend that Delwyn would one day return to them whole again, but she wasn't so sure. At one of the last visits, Delwyn told Gwen that she no longer astral travelled and rarely had hypnopompic or hypnagogic attacks. Gwen asked if she felt better for it. She responded quietly, "Feel? What's that?" She wasn't being facetious. Gwen went to the bathroom to wipe away her tears before meeting up with Greg that day. She didn't have the heart to tell him. Towards the end of Delwyn's stay, Greg and Mark's father passed away peacefully in his sleep. Even though he'd been ill for a long time and they'd known that the time was coming, it was still a shock and they grieved heavily, especially Mark. It was strange how it actually softened him, and without telling anyone, he showed up at the psych ward, asking Dr. Vorunsky if he could visit with Delwyn. At first she refused, but after a few more tries, she agreed. He sat down in the courtyard where she was writing in her journal, a blue one for hope. He placed a bunch of Daphne flowers on the table next to her. She looked up at him and noticed that he seemed like a different person. "Why did you bring flowers for me? I should be giving you flowers," she advised, picking them up to sniff them. Daphne was a favourite. "Just wanted to apologise for being such a prick over the years." He smiled after a small sigh. Delwyn replied, "Me too, and I'm so sorry about your dad." She felt the tears forming. She'd always loved Mr. Everson, as all the children had. Even though he had been stern, he was always kind to little children, especially dreamers like Delwyn. "Likewise," he said, and they sat there in silence for a while, before they warmed to each other as best they could. Delwyn advised, without a hint of meanness, "So, I hear the mirror's been destroyed. I bet you loved doing that." "Sorry," he replied meekly. "Well, it had to be done. I was nuts." They laughed. "So, do you think you're better now?" he asked. "I suppose so. The doctors think I'm almost ready to go home. They're just waiting to do a few more tests. You know, the medication. Blah." She smiled, and so did he. "I know Greg can't wait for you to get out. He wants you to go and live with him." "Well, how do you feel about that? You know, living with a psycho bitch?" She smiled sneakily at him. He rolled his lapis lazuli eyes and said, "Oh, I don't know. He's crazy too, so maybe you two were made for each other." They chuckled and she was relieved, at least for one mess to be cleared up. After another week, Delwyn was cleared to be released. She arrived at Greg's place feeling odd, but welcomed into his tidy country homestead, and at least he was next door to Gwen. She could see her any time she wanted. Gwen brought over far too many casseroles, and they hugged like they would never let go. Slowly but surely over the next few weeks, Delwyn got into the swing of organising an ordinary life. Greg didn't want her to feel like she had to go to work and was happy to support her while she wrote. She cooked and kept house, and they lived like a couple, even though they hadn't started a sexual relationship. She found it strange, sleeping in his bed next to him, even hugging, but they'd agreed that they would only go to the next level when it felt right. The doctors had also advised that it was the best way to go, not that Delwyn thought it was any of their business. She slowly started helping around the farm, and they even had Mark over for dinner every so often. Occasionally they went to Gwen's for dinner after helping at her farm with one thing or another. One evening, when the sun was taking its time to set, they were all sitting on Gwen's front veranda, drinking homemade lemonade and laughing at Peter chasing the dogs. The dragonflies were hanging low over the vegetable garden, and Delwyn decided to go for a wander. She found herself strolling near the granny flat, listening to the cicadas buzzing and the magpies warbling in the distance. It seemed that the chaos that had happened 6 months prior was someone else's nightmare. She picked off a seed pod from one of the banksia trees and smiled when she heard Greg and Mark laughing at one of Gwen's silly stories. As she walked down the path to the front door of the flat, she saw something glistening in the long grass next to the steps. She bent down to have a look and thought that it might have been a watch that someone had dropped. She parted the grass, and as she reached out to touch it, she realized that it was a piece of broken glass, or perhaps a shiny scrap of metal. It was cold, static, and familiar, which made her smile. Half an hour later, Mark asked Greg, "Where did Delwyn go?" Greg got up from his chair and said, "She wandered off somewhere. I'll go and see." He walked off and sauntered around the back of the cottage to fetch her. 10 minutes later, Gwen said to Mark, "Now Greg's missing. What are we going to do with those two?" They laughed and got up to follow Greg, with the dogs and Peter tagging along. As they got around the back of the cottage, they saw Greg running around frantically, calling out for Delwyn. "Delwyn, this is not funny. Where are you?" "Is she missing?" said Gwen, starting to panic. Mark said, "I'll deal with this." He walked out to the road next to the granny flat and yelled, "Delwyn, come out now or we'll call the cat team. Honestly, we'll call the cops. Don't do this to Greg or Gwen. Come out now." They stood for a minute in silence, straining their ears, but all they could hear was the buzzing of the cicadas. They split up, going in and out of sheds and buildings, calling out her name, becoming more and more afraid that she might have come to a horrible end. As they ran around, Gwen called the doctors, who advised to call the police just in case. They continued combing the whole farm and assisted the police when they arrived, well into the night, with sniffer dogs and flashlights, even a helicopter with thermal imaging, to no avail. Greg was crying and raging, already seething with grief and anger. "Delwyn!" he screamed. Greg tried to calm him down, but he wrenched himself out of her grip and kept searching through the night. Finally, at 3 a.m, he fell in a stupor on the step of the granny flat, crying and helpless. Peter ran up to him, but he brushed him aside. Then Peter started pawing at the grass next to the step, meowing and looking up at him, trying to get his attention. Greg looked down and flashed his torch and was nearly blinded by the reflection. He looked again and saw the piece of mirror. He picked it up and rolled it around in his hand, not caring that he'd just cut his index finger. He looked down at Peter, who was purring and staring at him intently. Something told him to put it in his pocket, so he did. Heaving himself up from the step, he dragged his feet back to Gwen's cottage, fearing that he would never see Delwyn again. The end.
that's the end of the first book in the series of the Storming Archives, and the next one will be Portal Stormer. So check in soon and continue on with this interesting story, or at least I hope it is interesting to you, and take care.